All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are Locked On Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking about if Desmond Ridder is set up for success here in Atlanta, as well as whether or not he will emerge after this season as the top quarterback from the 2022 draft class, and if he does, why he may owe that success to Kyle Pitts.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans. And of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And of course, we want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Get us a like when you do, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So, guys, today's episode, we're going to be sort of piggybacking on what we talked about on yesterday's episode. If you missed it, Desmond Ridder, scouting report, and talking about, again, sort of doubling down on the statement I made on yesterday's episode about how important the running game is. And we'll talk about Desmond Ridder in comparison to some of these other quarterbacks that were drafted this past year, particularly the four guys that we're sort of looking at as potential guys that can impact their team's season this year, alongside Malik Willis, Matt Corral, and Kenny Pickett. And we'll also be talking quite a bit about how Kyle Pitts really needs to sort of step up and carry this team if the Falcons are going to reach their full potential offensively. But again, if you didn't check out yesterday's episode, of course, I highly recommend it. 50 minutes of, premium Locked On Falcons content. But if you didn't check it out, the too long didn't listen version of that, and one of the things we discussed quite a bit on that episode, in addition to what I thought of Desmond Ridder's skill set, was that I think the running game matters when it comes to helping us predict, rookie quarterback success. And that's part of the reason why I wasn't as gung-ho on the idea that Desmond Ridder was going to come in immediately and tear things up here in Atlanta this upcoming season. And, I have an even better illustration of that point because we all sort of remember Matt Ryan's initial success here in Atlanta way back in 2008. His first NFL pass was a touchdown pass to Michael Jenkins on the skinny post against the Detroit Lions. And we all remember that. But do we also remember that somebody rushed for 220 yards in that game against the Lions? Of course, that was Michael Turner. Do we also remember that in that 2008 season when the Falcons won 11 games, that a certain person averaged 127 rushing yards in the Falcons' 11 wins and almost 5 yards per carry in those wins? And then in the 5 losses that year, only averaged about 60 yards per game and less than 4 yards per carry. And again, not to give Michael Turner all the credit, but I think a lot of it is kind of forgotten because it's really about, as I explained on yesterday's episode, and as I'm trying to illustrate on today's episode, it's really about setting up your guys to succeed, those young quarterbacks, so that they can just simply manage the game. You want to have that running game that can keep the offense on schedule without that guy being forced to have to, drop back and throw the ball every single time just for your offense to be able to move it. You also want to have a defense that can hold a lead, that can keep scores low so that guy is not forced to have to throw the ball 40 times a game for you to have a chance to win. Very few rookie quarterbacks are capable of coming into the league and being that type of player right away. And then, when we think about Matt Ryan in 2008, in addition to having Michael Turner, he also had a defense, right? To piggyback off of that point, like we sort of have spent the last decade, and it's been true that Matt Ryan's never really had a defense in the last decade, but those first 5 years in the NFL, Matt Ryan's defenses were pretty solid. At least the Falcons defense were pretty solid, right? That 08 defense, according to Football Outsiders DVO ranking, was the 17th best defense in the league that year, about league average. The next year they were 19th, again, roughly league average. 2010, they were 9th. 2011, they were 5th. 2012, they were 9th. So, the Falcons really, I think, set up Matt Ryan for success by having a run game, by having, competent defenses those first several years. And then once Matt Ryan was able to make that leap and the team transitioned to Julio Jones and they became pass first and they kind of got away with that. And, that led to a whole host of additional problems. But, I'm not saying anything new or exciting or groundbreaking to you guys, because this is literal that we've been talking about for the past year with Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot on what they've been trying to build, right? We were having this conversation, build up the roster first and then go get your quarterback. And part of the reason why I'm not as gung-ho and optimistic, however you want to phrase it, on this Falcons team heading into 2022 is I don't know if the Falcons have quite built up their roster. I think they've made strides, but I don't think they're close to finishing quite yet. And I think the way that some people are talking about this team is like they're 3 or 4 pieces away. And I don't think we're quite there yet. I would sit there and say maybe we're 3 or 4 pieces on offense, 3 or 4 pieces on defense. So we're maybe like 6 to 8 pieces away. And maybe, revisiting that conversation 6 months from now, we can see if that prediction is correct. And as this, summer unfolds, I can certainly go into detail on sort of what are the 3 or 4 pieces that I'm concerned with on either side of the ball. We won't get into that on today's episode. But, because of that situation, I don't know Desmond Ridder's been set up for success. And we can sort of compare and contrast the situation that he's going into in Atlanta, along with the situations of some of these other quarterbacks in this draft class. And we're only going to consider the 4 guys, including Ridder. That's Kenny Pickett, Desmond Ridder, Malik Willis, and Matt Corral. Mostly because when we look at this draft class, there were 6 guys. I called him the medium 6. Carson Strong, not really considering, he's an undrafted free agent, probably won't play in Philadelphia. Sam Howell, I'm not really considering as well as a guy that's a likely candidate to really make a name for him because he's probably going to be the 3rd string guy. Washington seems committed to Carson Wentz, and even if they're not, they still have Taylor Heineke. They have a fairly soft schedule, so I feel like that team shouldn't feel like they're going to start the season in a rough spot and have to make a quarterback change, by week 5, and certainly not to go to their 3rd string quarterback in Sam Howell. So, I look at these 4 guys, Pickett, Ridder, Willis, Corral, as the 4 guys that have a decent chance of playing this year. And we'll sort of continue today's episode talking a little bit more about their supporting cast and see if we can kind of make some bets about what each of these guys' potential success has. And we'll really talk about Desmond Ridder if he's set up for success as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But speaking of supporting cast, my supporting cast is really great because I'm part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And of course, subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on your preferred podcast app or on YouTube so that you can get 3 different shows, 4 different personalities, giving you 4 different perspectives on Atlanta, Georgia, and national sports. That is, of course, A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste. Find them all on your preferred podcast platform. And guys, I also want to tell you about Rock Auto, who's a proud sponsor of today's episode. We know that with ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders parts on their computer when you already have access to a computer, when you already have access to rockauto.com with a computer at home or in your pocket? Save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years with reliably low prices for every single customer. They have everything you need from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Just go to rockauto.com. Use their easy-to-use website to see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So let's rank these quarterbacks. And of course, I would love to sit here on this podcast and tell you Desmond Ridder is going to be QB1 when all is said and done because he's set up for success. Now, he may be the best quarterback in this draft class. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. And in a vacuum, Desmond Ridder may be the guy that is most pro-ready of this draft class to come in and produce right away in the NFL. The consensus was it was either Pickett or Ridder. Was that guy from a passing standpoint? Willis, if you factor in his ability to run the football. But we'll just sort of have to see. And let's talk a little bit more about quarterback environment, because if you listen to yesterday's episode, if you've listened to a lot of the episodes I've done over the last year and we'll do over the next, several months before the season starts, I'm a big believer that particularly early in the quarterback's career, as I illustrated with Michael Turner in the defense with the Falcons and Matt Ryan's early career, is a quarterback it's not purely a byproduct of their environment, but in the nature versus nurture debate, I think nurture takes a big chunk of it, probably at least half of the equation. And so when we look at these teams, let's look at their run game, let's look at their coaching staffs, let's look at the defense to see if these teams are putting these young four quarterbacks in the best environment to have success and not force them to have to be high-level passers right away in the NFL. And so starting with the coaching staffs, you got Mike Tomlin, you got Mike Vrabel, you got Matt Corral, and of course Arthur Smith. And probably my hottest take today is I don't quite know where I would rank Arthur Smith on that. He's either third or fourth on that list, right? Mike Tomlin's proven himself over 15 years. He's number one. Mike Vrabel has proven himself over the last 4 years. He's certainly number two. And then the question is, if Mike Vrabel's on one end of the spectrum, Matt Corral, who we think is, a prime candidate to be one of the first coaches fired this year, is at the bottom of this list. Where does Arthur Smith fit on that spectrum? And again, my hottest take today may be that he might be closer to Matt Corral than he is to Mike Vrabel. We hope that he's closer to Mike Vrabel than he is to Matt Corral, but I don't think we know the answer to that. And I know that runs counter to the popular narrative of like, how can you say Arthur Smith is not a good coach? I don't know if Arthur Smith's a good coach. I think we'll find that out this year. But, a lot of people sit here and say that he is a good coach because we won 7 games with a terrible roster. And my response to that every single time it comes up in the comments or someone sends an email or someone I read it written in an article on Twitter or whatever the case may be, I just say, miss me with that stuff, guys. Right? You're going to sit here and tell me that exhibit A and why Arthur Smith is a good coach is because the Falcons were able to beat Tim Boyle and the Lions. They were able to beat Trevor Siemian and the Saints. They were able to beat some of the worst quarterbacks in the league last year from a production standpoint. That's why he's a good coach, because they barely hung on. They let Trevor Siemian come back against them, but managed to dial up a big play to Cordero Patterson at the end of the game to set up the game-winning field goal. That's why he's a good coach. Okay, sure. I just sit here and I go, like, when I look at Arthur Smith's record, I don't look at the 2021 season as, exhibit A or a really compelling, piece of evidence that's going to, build my case to say that he's a good coach. I think we'll find out our answer in 2022. So, spicy take Tuesday, I guess you could say. But I'm still skeptical. It's still unknown to me when it comes to the coaching staff. So we'll see. When we talk about the running game, when we're looking at the running backs, it's hard for me to sit here and put the combination, the 1-2 punch that we presume we're going to have here in Atlanta, helping Desmond Ridder take pressure off of him with Cordero Patterson and Tyler Algier, and compare that to Derrick Henry, compare that to Najee Harris, compare that to Christian McCaffrey. Now, we know with all those teams, Henry dealt with some injuries, McCaffrey's dealt with injuries. Depth is a concern for those teams. If any of those guys go down, all of a sudden they don't look as impressive in terms of their run game as they look right now. But, clearly, I'm not going to sit here and stack the Falcons running backs above some of those other guys if they're healthy and productive. Now, the thing that the Falcons don't really have going for them is their offensive line, but neither of these teams have really much going for their offensive line. We could argue that these 4 teams, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, Carolina, and Atlanta, are probably 4 of the teams at the bottom 7 or 8 teams in terms of offensive line expectations this year, right? If you go to Pro Football Focus offensive line rankings at the end of last year, they had Carolina the weakest of these 4 teams. It ranked 31st, but guess what Carolina did this offseason? They went out and got 4 new starters, essentially, right? Steelers were 26. They went out and got 3 new starters. Titans were 16th on this list, and they have 2 new starters along their offensive line. And the Falcons, meanwhile, were 27th, right behind the Steelers. And essentially, they got no new starters. So I sit here and I go, okay. The Falcons are putting a lot of confidence in, improved coaching, year 2 jumps for several of these guys with the new coaching staff, or the camp competitions brought on from Justin Schaefer at left guard to push Jalen Mayfield, Drew Doman to push Matt Hennessy at center, and Jermaine Ifedi, the free agent pickup, to push Caleb McGarrett at that right tackle position. And all of those guys could wind up unseating those incumbents. But if the Falcons are starting 1, 2, or all 3 of those guys that are sort of camp competition, do you feel like they're going to go from 27th to 17th this year in the offensive line rankings, which, obviously would put their running game in a better situation and certainly would do a better job, presumably protecting whoever is the quarterback, whether it's Desmond Ridder or Marcus Mariota? Don't know. I remain somewhat skeptical of that. And when you talk defense, right, you look at DVOA rankings last year. The Titans were 12th, the Steelers were 14th, the Panthers were 15th, Falcons were 30th. What I will say, when we raise all these questions, I am less questioning Dean Pease. I'm less questioning the defense. I expect this defense to be scrappy. I think they got better this year. I have far less questions about Dean Pease's ability to coach than I do Arthur Smith's ability at this point in time. And I feel like the defense made strides. I feel like we'll do a better job getting pressure with just 4 guys. Adding Carter, adding Pickett. Hopefully Grady Jarrett will bounce back and look like his pre-2021 self. And, I'm also still holding out hope that the Falcons will go out there and get a 4th pass rusher along the interior defensive line that can come in on passing downs and give us a 4th guy that can allow us, with Dean Pease and the zone coverages that he wants to play, allow us to get pressure with 4 guys. I feel like the secondary, particularly at the cornerback position, got better. Casey Hayward, re-signing Isaiah Oliver, if he can pick up where he left off last year, of course, getting AJ Terrell, and hopefully between, Richie Grant, Jalen Hawkins, hopefully both of those guys step up and emerge as viable quality starters at the safety position, but hopefully at least one, we walk away this season feeling good about one of those guys being a long-term starter here and a quality starter. So I look at the secondary and be like, okay, they've made strides as well. They'll be better at matching up. They'll do a better job, hopefully, in the red zone when they play a lot more of that man coverage that Dean Pease likes to play in that area of the field. So I feel like we can be more that bend but don't break, scrappy defense that can keep, games competitive and give this offense opportunities to make plays. I'm not going to sit here and say the defense is going to be good, but I think they can be scrappy, right? They'll keep us competitive, especially if we can stop the run. And, again, reason number 12, why they should add another interior defensive lineman between now and the start of the season. But when I look at all of this in conjunction, coaching, run game, offensive line, defense, it's hard for me to sit here and put Ridder above some of these other quarterbacks. If again, going back to my belief that supporting cast is sort of the critical component to immediate success in the league for a lot of these quarterbacks, Ridder's not going to be number 1 on this. So it's hard for me to sit here today and say, with that belief that he's going to be QB1 by the time we get here 6 months from now. But I look at, Willis probably inheriting going into the best situation. Obviously, he's inheriting, should he take over as a starter for the Titans this year, a playoff team. And, I think the Titans probably got worse in this offseason than they were a year ago, but like they're still probably the most balanced and complete team, at least based off the most recent things we say. After that, you probably would put your money on Pickett just because the Steelers have a lot of areas of concern, but defense isn't one of them. Coaching isn't one of them. We'll see about the running game and whatnot. But it seems like they have those boxes checked. And, Ridder and Corral are kind of fighting it out for a 3rd place. And if I'm being honest, I think Corral in Carolina probably has a slightly better supporting cast. But, I want to believe in Arthur Smith, despite my skepticism. I want to believe that Marcus Mariota and Desmond Ridder will be better than Sam Darnold and Matt Corral. I really hope that we see that, even if Carolina technically might have a slightly better supporting cast when all things are considered. So we'll see about that. And my hope is that the defense, can close the gap and make a jump. I don't know if they're going to be 15th like Carolina was last year, but, maybe 20th, 22nd in terms of the Falcons defense this year in terms of DVO rankings. I think that's an achievable dream. So we'll see about that. But I think when it comes down to whether or not Desmond Ridder or Marcus Mariota has a successful season, it's not really about me buying into Arthur Smith or Dean Pease or Arnold Ebiketie or any of these guys. It's really about Kyle Pitts. Like if Desmond Ridder is going to blossom or this year, it's probably going to be because Kyle Pitts is that X factor, and that's what we're going to get into as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But don't worry about X factors when it comes to all of sports, because Locked On Sports Today is there for, okay, that was a terrible segue. I apologize. But Locked On Sports Today, hosted by Peter Bukowski, gives you all the lowdown on all of sports: football, basketball, baseball, hockey, horse racing, etc., in 20 minutes or less each and every day on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, or on YouTube. So, guys, let's talk more about Kyle Pitts being this X factor, because again, I think ultimately if the Falcons live up to their expectations, the hopes, dreams of Falcon fans all across the globe, it's all about Kyle Pitts more so than it is about Ridder, more so than it is about Marcus Mariota. And the way I would explain that is like we go back to last year and we look at the 3 monster games that Kyle Pitts had against the Jets, against the Dolphins, against the Lions, and saw how much it elevated this team. Certainly it didn't elevate the team that made us unbeatable, because Tim Boyle and Trevor Siemian nearly took care of business against that. But, when I look at Arthur Smith's body of work, despite my skepticism, I see in Atlanta last year, as well as Tennessee in the previous years, that if his playmakers, like we saw Kyle Pitts do in those 3 games, aren't making plays, aren't getting yak, and by yak, we're meaning both yards after contact for the receivers, or yards after contact for the runners, I'm sorry, and yards after catch for the receivers. If his playmakers are doing that, like Derrick Henry did, and like A.J. Brown did, and like Corey Davis did, and like Kyle Pitts did, and Cordero Patterson did, his offense works, right? That's what his body of work tells me, that he's not necessarily this innovative mind, but he's living and dying mostly off of the quality of his playmakers. And while I want to believe in Drake London, I want to believe in Bryan Edwards, I think they're better assets than what he had a year ago. I don't know if they're going to be the big, yards after catch guys that certainly AJ Brown was, right? London, Edwards have the physicality that AJ Brown brought to the table, but I don't know if they have the speed that AJ Brown brought to the table. And that was kind of the thing that made AJ Brown so effective a weapon, particularly running all those dig routes, those 2 years under Arthur Smith in Tennessee, because he not only had the physicality to break the tackles and the speed to run away from guys and turn, those 12-yard digs into 40-yard plays. And when I look at this Falcons team, the one guy that I look at and say, this guy's on a different level from the players that he's playing against each and every Sunday. It's not Drake London. It's not Bryan Edwards that I'm looking at. It's Kyle Pitts that I'm looking at as that one guy that if anybody's going to be AJ Brown, if anybody's going to be Derrick Henry, if anybody's going to be Julio Jones, it's Kyle Pitts. And I look at, the PFF numbers, and they say, Kyle Pitts only broke 5 tackles last year. And that was just one more than Calvin Ridley. Right. And we sit here and say, Calvin really wasn't physical enough to play in his defense. And in 5 games, he broke 4 tackles. And in 16 games, Kyle Pitts basically broke only 5 tackles. And 2 of those came on one 60-yard play in week 17. So for the first, 16 weeks of the season, 15 games of the season, Kyle Pitts had 3 broken tackles. Obviously, that's going to have to change, because it's going to be really important for this offense to be explosive this year, that when Arthur Smith is drawing up all these 3-by-1 sets, when we go back and we look at Bryan Edwards highlights, a lot of them come out of 3-by-1 sets, that when he's got that one guy singled up on the outside on those 3-by-1 sets, 3 receivers to this side, 1 receiver to this side, or vice versa, whether that's Kyle Pitts, whether that's Bryan Edwards, whether that's Drake London, that guy has to win in those situations. And if that's going to be our offense, then so be it, right? And feast and famine. Based off of those guys winning those one-on-one situations with those corners on the outside, particularly against certain teams like the Saints, who we face in week 1, who are going to play a lot of man coverage, at least based off of how they played last year, right? And they're probably going to do what they did last year and put Marshawn Lattimore on Kyle Pitts. And Kyle Pitts has to win that matchup. Again, I'm pulling numbers out of my butt, but basically I'll sit here and tell you that if Kyle Pitts in week 1 doesn't go out and have 8 catches for 113 yards or whatever and 2 touchdowns, I'm not going to be looking too optimistic about the rest of the Falcons season. So we need to see Kyle Pitts be that guy. He needs to be a dude. And we saw flashes of it last year in a handful of games, but instead of 3 monster games like we saw last year, that needs to be 6. That needs to be 8. That needs to be 10 this year, I think, for the Falcons to reach their full height. Again, they got to be the type of offense, whether it's Pitts running them, whether it's London running them, whether it's Edwards running them, somebody else running them on those dig routes, turning those 12-yard throws into 25, 30-plus yard gains. And part of the reason why Cordero Patterson was such a breath of fresh air last year is because he was one of the few guys that was out there breaking tackles, out there getting yards after contact, getting yards after catch. Right. And again, that's another reason why people give Arthur Smith so much. Oh, look what he did with Cordero Patterson. Did he do that with Cordero Patterson, or was Cordero Patterson just Cordero Patterson? Again, that's part of my skepticism, because we look at Cordero Patterson, who was a Hall of Fame caliber. If anybody qualified to go to the Hall of Fame purely off of their ability as a kickoff returner, Cordero Patterson is at the front of that line. And so we know he was already gifted. 1st round pick, Hall of Fame caliber kickoff returner. He was gifted with the ball in his hands. So does Arthur Smith deserve all that credit? Is it Arthur Smith's play calling and how he utilized Cordero Patterson that led to him being great with the ball in his hands and one of the few standouts there? Or is it just Cordero Patterson's that good? That is a question, right? So I sit here and I go, hopefully with Arthur Smith, hopefully his play calling will be improved so that he can better feature those guys. But if it's not, we're relying on Pitts primarily, along with some of these other guys, to be dudes, right? And I think London is going to be good. I think Edwards is a solid pickup for the Falcons, but I'm not expecting, Drake London, particularly that week 1 game against the Saints, to come out and like gangbusters and tear it up the league. right? I'm not expecting Bryan Edwards as probably a guy that's classically a number 3 wide receiver, but probably will be the number 2 guy, or really the number 3 guy behind Pitts in London here. That's kind of what he is. And I think he can be good in that role, but like I don't expect him to go out there and do incredible things here in Atlanta that he wasn't doing with the Raiders. And he did good things with the Raiders, but I'm not expecting him to be this world-class 1,000-yard receiver or anything like that this season. So it's going to be fun to revisit this conversation 6 months from now. And looking back at this quarterback group, looking back at whether or not Pitts lived up to those expectations, and seeing sort of what was accurate. Like, again, as I said at the top of the show, we should, at least theoretically, at least I'm presenting the argument that based off of supporting cast, we should have been able to predict Mac Jones looking the best out of that quarterback class a year ago, given that he inherited the best run game, the best defense among the 5 quarterbacks taken in round 1 last year. And I think based off of that belief, that philosophy, that perspective, we should be able to do the same thing with at least the 4 top quarterbacks in this year's draft class. And again, if I'm putting my money on, it's probably going to be Willis 1, Pickett 2, hopefully Ridder 3. Hopefully Matt Corral's not a better bet than Desmond Ridder this season. But it's going to be interesting with this group because of this quartet of guys. Ridder and Corral probably the 2 best bets to actually get significant amount of playing time this year. Again, we talked about this a ton already for the last several months. Is Marcus Mariota going to start 17 games for Falcons? It seems doubtful to me sitting here today. 7, 8, 9, maybe more than that. We know that Carolina does not want to be in bed with Sam Darnold. And so that means a decent chance Matt Corral could be playing. We'll see if they make any moves for Baker Mayfield or Jimmy Garoppolo before the season starts, but time will tell, right? Tennessee's going to be interesting because, again, Willis seems to be put in the best position to succeed, and they have an interesting start to their schedule. They got a week 6 bye, but they start the season against the Giants, the Bills, Raiders, Colts, Washington, right? There are some wins in there, and we know Tennessee was very successful against some of the good teams last year. They were not particularly successful against some of the worst teams that they faced this year, and it'll be interesting to see how they start their season because if they start slow, going into that bye week and they're maybe like 1-5 or 2-4 or something like that, we may see Malik Willis by November. And then again, assuming that, guys are healthy and whatnot, he's potentially going to be the guy that could do the most damage given the supporting cast that he has. But we all know that, careers and quarterback careers are not decided based off of, their first 6 starts or their first season or anything like that. Pickett has the benefit of insulation as a first round pick that it's very unlikely that Pittsburgh's going to give up on him after 1 season. Willis has insulation only from the fact that if Tannehill continues to be like Tannehill and the Titans continue to win, then it doesn't really matter with that because they'll continue to, build themselves like a Super Bowl caliber team and compete for those. But Ridder and Corral don't have that luxury because I don't think Mariota, I don't think Sam Darnold are long-term options for either one of those teams, and both guys being 3rd round picks mean that if they do play, they're going to have to perform or else, I guess is the best way of describing it. So we'll see how that goes, guys. That will do it for us here as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, guys. Tomorrow, I believe is the last day of May. And we'll talk about, possible post June 1 moves that the Falcons can make, including signing some of those defensive linemen. We'll look at sort of who's available and what moves we can expect from the Falcons, including, if Deion Jones is truly a goner, as we continue later this week on today's episode. And I'm recording this on Memorial Day, Monday, and I want to apologize for saying shout out to the service members at the end of yesterday's episode. My excuse is, talking for 50 minutes, your brain kind of stops working by the end of that. That's why, the people at Locked On tell me, you got to keep it under 30, Aaron. So I apologize for that. Memorial Day is all about commemorating all those folks that laid down their lives in previous wars, basically for the idea of America. Because I know a lot of people that fought and died for this country in a variety of their wars were people of color that certainly were not incorporated in the institutions of America. It was more the idea of America that they were fighting for. And they did that out of duty. And that certainly deserves a much more respect than me saying shout out to the service members at the end of yesterday's episode. So that's what I'll say, guys. I hope you have a great Memorial Day. and commemorate all those that laid down their lives for that here in the States. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here. Hopefully that's a better way of ending the episode than yesterday's episode. As I said, we'll be talking more about what adjustments the Falcons could make post June 1st on tomorrow's episode. If you want to provide your feedback on anything I've discussed on today's episode, anything you want me to discuss on future episodes, or anything I've discussed on past episodes, you can do so by hitting me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, guys. And as always, I thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Always have recommendations to what your second listen should be. In addition to Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Sports Today, why not check out Locked On NFL to find out all the latest news around the league for all 31 other NFL teams in addition to the Atlanta Falcons. So, guys, appreciate it. Till then.